Welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
Here again, we get to rejoice in truth and the way that it impacts our lives and the way that it is so incredibly relevant. So glad you're tuning in to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast. That's our goal every week, to brag on Jesus and to celebrate the superiority of the Christian worldview. Before we do that, we got a lot of great stuff happening right here that hopefully if you're in the area, you can take advantage of. First of all, coming up this weekend is our market share ministry, of which Pastor Andrew navigates and leads the way on that with a great team around him. But talk about what are you serving up on Saturday? Besides some good food.
Yeah, we're having breakfast 8 o'clock, and then we're talking about what does making disciple look like in the marketplace. Now, often
great question.
Often people associate making disciple only with church activities.
Right.
But like you said, we should be making disciple in every realm of our lives, in our family, with our wives, with our kids, with our husbands, and with our boss, with our employees.
This is the beautiful understanding of the kingdom. Again, it transcends the normal boundaries. We tend to think of church and Jesus and religious things as happening in the four walls on Sunday, but discipleship, as you said, is a whole life event. It involves every aspect of our life.
And we want to talk about what it looks like to be making disciple in a non-Christian workplace. You know, I think one example we often refer to is Joseph.
Yeah.
You know, he said, "I fathered Pharaoh." You know, in many ways, he discipled the king.
Here, I love this. So he's a man that's not in the top position. He's a supporting player, obviously a high-ranking supporting player, but he fathers, and I love that word. He comes in as a spiritual mentor, guide, father to a Pharaoh, and influences him in amazing ways.
And saved several nations.
Yeah.
And anyway, the point is, we want to expand the word. When we think about disciples, we often think, the rabbi with his flock of students. None of us are really living that lifestyle right now. I don't have a flock of students following me around everywhere I go. But our call is to make disciples of all nations. So what does that look like in the most practical place?
That's really good.
Yeah.
So that's what time on Saturday?
Well, breakfast starts at 8.
And we need you to register online so that we make sure we have enough food for you.
Yeah,
right?
Please do that. And we have a super exciting conference coming out. We call it the Avada conference.
Yeah, talk about that word Avada. What does that mean? Where did that come from? And how does that tie into the conference?
Yeah, we really learned that word Avada from a group called Kingdom at Work down in Lubbock, Texas. The word Avada is the Hebrew word for work, worship, and service. In other words, to the Jews, they made no distinction between work and worship. So work is worship.
So we're hosting a conference we're calling Avada. Yeah. In the first week in November.
First weekend in November, Friday,
and,
Saturday.
Who's invited? And how do people find out more information?
Well, it's on our website. Everybody's invited. We come different. We come with different tracks for business owners, for high level leaders in the company, for frontline workers, and even for pastors. The idea is that if you want your everyday work, to not be menial, to be powerful, to be worship, to be a service unto God, to be so meaningful, and to equip you to get that sense of anointing and meaning when you go into work. I mean, that's really our purpose.
So this is actually a market share event coming out of Living Stones. It's one of our ministries, but we're partnering with our friends at Kingdom at Work, who will be sharing some of the sessions with us. And obviously it's a hand-in-glove situation. We've been so blessed by that ministry. But we also want to see a larger presence emerge right here as a church family. We minister to people in the marketplace.
Yeah, we're looking for a great opportunity to network and to connect with business leaders in our community, but also having a great contingent coming down from Lubbock, coming up from Lubbock to join us. So
it's going to be
surprising faces.
I'm excited. It's going to be really great.
Registration on lstones.org.
And this will be a history-making breakthrough moment for us, as it's our first marketplace conference that we're hosting. Hopefully, one of many more to come. Let's also talk about a couple more opportunities. We got our men's encounter coming up in September. That's going to be really, really powerful. We encourage you all to sign up for that, especially, obviously, I'm speaking to the men right now. Ladies Encounter is already maxed out, and the waiting list is already maxed out. We're at our second or third or fourth waiting list, so it looks like if you're on that waiting list, you're going to probably need to look to the Winter Encounter, which is coming up. And talk a little bit about Band of Brothers, because that's a highlight.
Just real quick before there, so some hope for next year. We're going to have 3 encounters next year.
Yes.
So we did 2 this year, and we maxed those out. So
we're doing the same for men. We'll have 3 encounters for the men
so
as
there's
well.
hope coming for next year. So if you
hold
can't sign
on.
up for this one.
Hold on.
We're preparing for more for next year.
But the Band of Brothers is our network of related pastors annual event where all the men from the network come together. Of course, we hosted the Flourish Women's Conference as well, where all the ladies came together, but this Band of Brothers Conference is coming up in October.
Yep.
You will not want to miss it. There will be hundreds and hundreds. We're hoping for probably 500 men this year, and it's going to be powerful, so you won't want to miss it.
Yeah. And where can you sign up for that? On our website?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, register.
Stones.org. Yep.
Hit register for that right now. We're in a chapter in the book Strange New World that we've been using as kind of a template for our discussion in these podcasts. The title of the chapter is Plastic People, Liquid World. And we've been talking about how our identity, how the idea of personhood has shifted to where we're in really a scenario right now that's crazy. And I've been addressing a lot of this in my Sunday sermon series called Me. I encourage you to check it out at lstones.org under the media page. We're talking about a lot of the LGBTQ, transgender issues, identity issues that are impacting us across the board from East Coast to West Coast and everybody in between. And just by way of review, Pastor Andrew and I'll hit a couple of these bullet points. We talked about how we're living in a world where authority has shifted from biology or the external world to the interior psychological realm of feelings. And so what you feel about who you are has more weight now, more authority than anything else, which is a new phenomenon.
And that came from Rousseau and kind of the Romanticism, which says your authentic self is the true self.
Right.
You know?
What you feel is more important than anything else.
Yeah.
Second thing was the centrality of sexual desire. Obviously, if who I am is what I feel, much of what I feel is sexual in nature, whether good or bad, and therefore we've seen the ascendance of sexuality as a big part, in fact, the core part of our identity. We can thank Freud for that, and others, Wilhelm Reich, as we talked about.
Basically, the pursuit of happiness is centered around your sexual desires.
Right, which
as
we've seen, leads to a lot of problems because if making myself happy means fully engaging in my sexuality, then there's usually a wake of
unrestrained sexual desires,
pleasure. So thus we have all this the sexual brokenness in our culture today. Then we move to this whole point of how our identity has largely become political and not personal. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, we used to talk about our personal identities, but now it's become politicized, and we have a government enforcing certain agendas.
Yeah, because this is no longer your personal issue. Now this has become a civil issue. When you have related the pursuit of happiness to your identity and inner feelings, now it's a civil rights issue.
Right.
Now it's a state issue. It's a constitutional issue. You know, you're not allowed to pursue your happiness because of all these different things. So there's a lot of entanglement in all these.
And we've talked about these things, but it's interesting how these are all new ideas that are leading to this brave new world. And then last podcast we talked about cultural and technological factors that have really come into play to make these philosophical ideas actually livable.
Yeah.
If we wouldn't have had internet, for instance, if we wouldn't have had the pill and some of these other things, we would not be able to be pushing this strange new agenda that we find as it relates to personhood. Now, the last few weeks in my series we've been preaching at Living Stones, we've been in Genesis chapter 1, and we highlighted the fact that human beings are not animals. And so the whole notion of personhood kind of goes back to this idea of volition and freedom and the fact that we are able to do things that the animal world cannot do. I mean, you and I, we're talking about dreaming about a conference in November. My dog is not doing that. The birds out there are not doing that. They're not thinking about choices they can make that can shape who they are and what they can do. Those are things that are uniquely human.
Yeah.
And of course, our explanation for that is not evolution. Our explanation for that is we're created in the image and likeness of God. And so this whole notion of freedom plays a big part in who we are. And yet there are some things that our freedom had nothing to do with. For instance, it's, in other words, it's beyond our choices.
Yeah.
Like I was born in the family I was born in, you were born in the family you were born in. We had no choice over that. The nation that we're raised in, right? The community that we're born in, the schools that we attend. I mean, there's a lot of things about our lives that are completely beyond our volition and our freedom. In other words, we're part of a social community, a larger fabric of our society, which, whether we know it or not, impacts our identities as people.
Yeah.
In other words, we're made for freedom, but there's this other big need we have to belong. And that's the thing that is being impacted right now as it relates to technology and other things. Like, how do we determine who we belong to? It used to be things like our church, our local church. In fact, most people would grow up and you went to the church right down the street. And it was within walking distance. It was your family, what your mom and dad, who they were and how they taught you and the values they imparted to you, right? It was your state, your nation. In other words, we grew up patriotic. We stand up to this day, in most places anyway, at football games. What do? Will you kindly remove your hat? Mm-hmm. And we put our hand over our heart and we sing the national anthem because patriotism and what it meant to be an American was a big part of what shaped us. Mm-hmm. So this whole notion, he shares in the book, that you're playing on recess and you pick two captains and you and I start picking our teams. And if you're one of the first people picked, it gave you a sense of belonging. If you're the last person picked, it kind of said, yeah, you don't measure up. And so there's this deep God-given longing inside of human beings, not only to be free and to make choices, but to belong to somewhere, to be part of a tribe, so to speak. And so he talks about this whole idea.
So there's a little bit of paradox here between this desire to be free and make your choices, but we also found in ourselves this desire to belong and to conform.
Right.
So it's interesting because even like the rebels, like that we kind of glorify in our culture, the standout, eventually there's a group of people start following them, and they're no longer their standout,
right.
and they become a community in itself.
Yeah, they're rebelling, and they're all wearing radical clothing, but then, everybody in that group wears the same clothing. So you're trying to be different and a rebel, but everybody's wearing
eventually
the same
they conform to the same thing. So I how do you explain that psychologically? For us, I think it's because we are human, we're limited, and we don't even know what's in our hearts. So there's a longing to be nonconformist, to stand out, to be different, to go against the grain and be ourselves and be our authentic self. But then everybody's their authentic self, and there's a degree of so I don't really think I think what I got out of that section is we as humans don't really know what we want. We are, one day we wake up, we're like, I want to be a rebel. Next day it's like, I need friends, and then you just go back and forth.
Well,
and that's
how about
human
this?
nature.
So the nature of being a part of a group is the group has a certain set of norms or standards. Yeah. Like, to be a part of the group, you have to abide by the standards, right? So if you're a rebel and you're rebelling against this set of standards, it's funny that your rebellion takes you to a place where now you're part of a group they don't have no standards, they have their own standards.
Right.
And you can't be a part of that group unless you embrace those cultural norms.
Right.
So it's the irony that you can never belong unless there's a set of behaviors or expectations or norms that you must conform to.
Right. So being a rebel and going against the grain can never be the transcendent, consistent value, because the moment you rebel and other people join your rebellion, you are no longer a rebel because we see this in the tolerance movement, the woke movement, right?
Yep.
Like you need to be tolerant, you need to accept, you need to go against the norm. Well, they create their own standards, and if you go against their norm, you're silenced on Twitter, you're silenced on YouTube, right? So at some point, the anti-establishment becomes the establishment. So anti-establishment by itself cannot be a vital principle that's consistently followed throughout, right? You simply saying, I want a different set of rules.
Right.
But that's not how the rebels frame it. They frame it as, we're a rebel, we're going against the rule. They don't frame it as, we want to create our own kingdom, our own rules, right?
But they're like, I'm a rebel, and so are all my friends.
Yeah.
But you can't be in our group unless...
How dare you rebel against our rebellion,
Well, okay, so let's talk about, in the church, we've got these folks that are like, well, who are you to make me conform to a certain set of standards? In other words, to be part of the kingdom of God, to be part of the local church, God has spoken about certain ethical norms, right? Behavioral norms, like thou shalt not. That's an ethical norm. And when you confront people as a pastor with sin, and you say, look, you need to repent of this, whatever it is. And they say, no, I'm not going to repent. I'm just going to keep coming to church and acting like a Christian, but I'm not going to follow the norms of the kingdom. Then biblically speaking, the Bible instructs us to say, you know what, then you cannot be a part of this community of faith because you're not willing to conform, not to what I think is right, but to what God says is true. So the world looks at that and condemns the church as we're being mean, we're not kind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then they create their own group, they create their own norms, and then they cancel people who don't abide by those.
Yeah,
so
they have their own religion.
So it's hypocritical. And as you pointed out, you're going to belong somewhere. Right. The choice is what ethical norms or standards or behaviors do you want to conform to?
And that's the consistent argument. That's the transparent, authentic argument, is to honestly say, I don't like your rules. I want my rules. And I can come to you and say, let's have a real debate about your worldview, your kingdom versus my kingdom. But that's not the argument today. The argument today is, you have a worldview. How dare you impose your worldview on me?
Right.
So I don't even need to defend my worldview. I just need to attack yours.
Which, as we talked about, is fundamentally irrational. Right. Because as soon as you say, well, my rules are that there are no rules. Well, you just made a rule.
You just made a rule.
Exactly. That's the beauty of truth, is you can never get away from truth. Right. It's always staring you in the face.
Well, so in this world in which people are not upfront about their worldview or their stand or their religion or their hierarchy, what we have is what he says, the politics of recognition, which is the example you gave about picking teams in the in gym class, right?
Right.
Who gets recognized first and who gets recognized last. When you get picked first, you have a degree of honor or whatever to it. But when you pick last, you're a loser.
Right, and no one wants to be. So you decide you're going to not be part of that exercise at recess, and you go become part of another group to where you feel accepted and belong. And that's just human nature. But he was talking about this idea of nation state. We used to see ourselves as Americans. Like, even if you lived on the border of Mexico, proximity-wise, like you live in El Paso, you're still going to identify with somebody who lives in Maine more than you're going to identify with somebody who lives in Mexico, because you have a shared set of beliefs and customs and a meta-narrative about what it means to be an American. Right. And there's a sense of patriotism that pulls us together. So no matter whether we live in the Southwest or the Northeast or what part of the country, we're still an American. And even in elections, it used to be when an election was over, if the person you wanted didn't get elected into power, you still said, okay, well, we're still Americans at the end of the day, and my identity as an American transcends even my identity, whatever political party that I'm in. But the last few elections have proven that's not the case. It's like we're in a civil war, and we're fighting tooth and nail to hold power, and we're really the divided states of America right now. There's no longer a transcendent piece of identity that says, first and foremost, I'm an American. And he gives the example in the book, he's from Great Britain, when the BLM riots were going on in America, there were people marching on the streets in Great Britain, even though culturally and from a nation-state perspective, they had more in common with Hong Kong than with riots in America.
Because Hong Kong used to be part of British territory.
Exactly.
Just a couple decades ago. Right.
Yeah, it was part of their history, part of their story. Right. And he was saying how strange that was. And, of course, he goes on to explain why that happened. The pill opened the door to support the sexual revolution because it gave you some form of control over pregnancy, right? He's now saying with the advent of the internet, people are able to find and pursue the identities and the tribes, so to speak, that they want to be a part of. And so issues of time and space and borders and nationality and all these things, the history that used to hold us together, are now no longer in play. And people are finding an identity on an internet. Again, he gave this strange example during ISIS when they're cutting people's heads off. There were people who were pledging allegiance to ISIS, American kids, on the internet because somehow they found that to be cool or they identified somehow with the ISIS movement. And you're sitting here scratching your head going, why is some kid from some Midwest small town finding identity with ISIS over in the Middle East, where they've never been. They have nothing in common. They have no shared history, no shared heroes, and yet they're somehow finding in their own minds a place in that movement more than what it means to be an American.
Right, because these boundaries that traditionally, like you said, the nation state, the church, and the family has been eroded over the last several decades.
Yep.
So those shared identity has been destroyed. Okay. Even traditionally, even for Americans, what does it mean to be American? It means that you believe in a set of documents called the Constitution. Okay. Though we might have different slight interpretation, in the day we say, hey, we support the Constitution. America is not a straight democracy, which is like mob rule. America is based on constitutional republic. In other words, the Constitution sets the rules for what happens. But now the Constitution is no longer a uniting factor. Constitution is actually a dividing factor.
Right. The Constitution is being viewed as a prejudicial document, and this was what was disturbing to me. You're watching the news, and you're watching all these cities up in flames, and then you're going to university campuses, and you're seeing people that were part of our shared history. Now, let me just mention, there are no pure heroes other than Jesus Christ. There's no perfect people, but every single person that we've made a statue out of made a significant contribution to the history of where we've gotten to today. And unless you understand the flow of ideas and the contribution those individuals made, which is the purpose, by the way, of teaching history in our schools, is that's where our heroes come from. Those are the people we celebrate. So nobody would have questioned, for instance, Abraham Lincoln sitting there in this beautiful monument in Washington, D.C., until now. There were people spraying graffiti over Lincoln, who was a massive, historical figure in the civil rights movement, and to the Civil War, and to the freeing of slaves in America. And yet, who would have thought Lincoln would come under attack, or Washington, the founder of our nation? These were people that pulled us together, not people that separated us. But all that has been turned on its head, literally, and there's been such poison poured into our historical narrative.
So when you got the nation state being, the sense of community of the nation state of the United States of America being destroyed, you have the family, you have the church, all these are being dismantled, right? So what you do is, what happens, you create all these vacuums for community, because human nature still longs for belong. So what happens is, for those who, many took advantage of that, they say, well, because of the internet, I can create a community anywhere. I can go online and create a YouTube channel and create a community. People even call it the LGBT community, the minority community, the dog lovers community.
Well, remember when the ad came out, for Jeep? Mm-hmm. It's a Jeep thing, like Jeep created its own community of Jeep lovers, right?
Facebook, their commercial, there's there's a million communities for you to choose from, right?
Right.
So when you have your community, becomes like a mall, a shopping list. Like, I want to be part of this. I want to be part a little bit of this, a part of this. What happens? There's no need for a nation state. There's no need for family. There's no need for religion.
And that's where he talks about a liquid world, because anything that was firm that held us together has just become liquid. It's like melting wax.
Yep.
And so there is no terra firma.
Right.
Intellectually, philosophically, from an identity standpoint, everything is fluid now. And like you said, you get to pick and choose your identity or your group. Sometimes it's virtual. You've never even met these people. You
might have more in common with somebody on the other side of the world than your next door neighbor.
Exactly.
And that's what's happening in our community in the United States right now, in many countries right now. That's what's happening.
And so let's talk about the impact of this. This is actually scary for nations. I mean, you can see where everything is moving toward this kind of globalist, one world kind of situation. Yep. Because all the things that held us together and protected us. I want to. The Tower of Babel was protection. It was God saying, "You're not all going to come together under a humanistic banner of your own meta narrative, right? Of identity and whatever. I'm going to divide you based upon language, so that your identities are local. So that we even talk about this in government, local government." Making local decisions promotes liberty. Globalism produces tyranny. I mean, you can see where when America cannot be held together by any overarching narrative, we're ripe for destruction.
Yep.
And our freedoms are fragile. We'll get into that in our next podcast. I mean, things you hear people on the left now saying things like, "We don't need a First Amendment. The First Amendment produces racism or whatever. We don't need it. Certainly don't need a Second Amendment. We need to strip everybody of their right to bear arms." And all these things that were prized possessions that were actually inalienable rights from God. When you throw God out, everything becomes liquid. Everything falls apart.
Well, freedom of religion and freedom of speech used to be one of the unifying factors to say, hey,
well, it was the sacred virtue of the left. I mean, they prided themselves in
Well, I
free
disagree
speech.
with what you're saying, but I agree that you have the right to say it.
Right.
That used to be unifying, and that's a powerful unifying factor because, again, underlining our difference in opinion is saying, you know what, I still respect that you're made in the image likeness of God, and you get to express yourself without fear of harm or persecution. That is no longer a unifying factor, which is crazy if you really think about it. But that's where we are today because because the allegiance to something like the First Amendment, which used to be like the pillar of civil rights, right, is no longer there because they have allegiance to other things. Because at the end of the day, you are judging by your allegiance. My allegiance to the Constitution is down here, but my allegiance to this random community I joined on Facebook is up here.
Yep.
That's where we are today.
Yep. And so here's what you're having. Instead of natural rights, we have legal rights. This is a big shift. Natural rights are rights that the state has to recognize that come from God. They're pre-government.
Yeah.
Legal rights are rights created by governments, and those legal rights can be twisted, can be shifted. One minute that you have the right, the next election, you don't have the right. And that's very, very scary as it relates to things like a simple belief that as parents, we have the authority over our kids. That's not a legal right. That's a natural right. That marriage should be between a man and a woman. That's not some government told us that. Marriage is pre-government. It was created by God. These are all sacred things, like the sanctity of life. That's not a legal right. That's a natural right. But when you lose that overarching sense of a God-created world with God-given rights, everything becomes in the realm of politics, and politics gets blown out of proportion.
And I
That's
think
where we are
just
today.
in terms of prosperity, okay, just from the very basic standpoint of if you want to start a business, if you have these crazy instability every 2 or 4 years, probably every 2 years, there's a change of regime, and then all of a sudden these rights we no longer have them. Nobody wants to establish any type of infrastructure. Nobody wants to start any business there.
Yep.
It's so hard because at one point you're paying taxes up here, the next is down here, but the next is up here. You just can't do anything.
And even where we're at now, where somehow one man, the President of the United States, can pass an executive order and wipe out the personal private debt of individuals.
He didn't wipe it out. He transferred it.
Well, absolutely.
He transferred.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, you sit back and go, wait a minute. What is the federal government doing micromanaging businesses and involved in the banking industry, where now the government becomes the bank, and we're picking and choosing who we're giving loans to? I mean, this is insanity. But what's scary is we have a whole generation of young people that think this is absolutely normal. It is devastating to the foundations of liberty.
One of the reasons why I believe that America has been so successful is because of the crazy amount of stability we have had over the last couple hundred years because of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
Because within the stability, people can innovate and they can create and they can build and they can establish businesses. And that came from the genius of the Constitution.
Right.
How quickly do regimes change? Look at some of these countries. Every couple decades, there's a
yeah.
new regime, there's a new
revelation.
People get killed. I mean, just like you can't do anything. You can't create, you can't innovate anything in those culture. But that's what's happening right now. We're in a place of crazy upheaval because of different communities.
And think about this, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, there were stories coming out from the, run-of-the-mill foot soldier that they had no idea that there was going to be a war. They had no idea that, like, here they are now fighting sometimes their family members, right, who are Ukrainian. The point is the morale was so low. They're fighting a war that doesn't make any sense to them. There's no heart in it. I remember hearing General Boykin say that so much of being a good soldier is transcendence. In other words, you're willing to lay your life down for shared values that are greater than life itself. The question I'm asking, and I think a lot of people are asking, is in America today, what are those common shared values that we're willing to literally lay our lives down to fight for? I mean, you look back at the Revolution, the Civil War, some of these things, you look at World War I, World War II, what made America so great was the fact that we were so unified and proud, literally, to be an American. Right. And what did it mean to be an American? Well, there was shared values that we all celebrated, even though we were different. Our ethnicities were different, our neighborhoods were different, our socioeconomics was different. There's so many differences, but it was our shared values of what it meant to be an American and what America stood for. Right. All of that's being poisoned right now. We are a divided nation. I wonder if anybody's willing to fight and die for anything. When you live in a secular world with no transcendent values, all you care about is your identity, your rights, your freedoms, your pleasure, your sexual expression, then there's nothing worth fighting for, and you become a very, very vulnerable nation hanging by a thread. And I really think that's where we are right now. And unless there is an awakening of a meta narrative that pulls us together, namely the kingdom of God and the gospel, I think we're in a scary place,
And that's I think, to me, the good news. It's actually a silver. It's not just a silver lining. It's actually clarifying everything, which is that's what people understand kingdom more than anything else right now, because everyone's establishing the little kingdom. When you create a community, you're creating like who's accepted, what are the rules of engagement, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You're basically creating your little kingdom. And when Jesus came, he came to usher in a brand new kingdom, brand new rules. Yep. And he's saying there's a new king, and if you want to be a leader in this kingdom, you're going to be the servant, right? First will be last, and last will be first. If you want to really live in this kingdom, you have to lay your life down. He laid out the rules for this new kingdom, right? And in many ways, we have a great opportunity through the internet, through all these different media, to usher in not our own kingdom, not our own little Christian circle, but the kingdom of God, to align ourselves to God's kingdom and really make his message known. So in many ways, yes, the internet has opened the world to all kind of messed up stuff, but it's also a great opportunity for us to usher in his kingdom. Not just like a Christian message, not just like our own personal brand, but the message of the king himself.
Well, when I think of local churches as embassies of the kingdom and of the king, people are looking for belonging. The local church should be a place where people find love and acceptance, where they're seen, where they're known, where their gifts are explored, discovered, enhanced, where they're able to find meaning in loving and serving. I mean, the church is the answer to the fractured.
If the church is abiding by the kingdom, because there are many churches that are not. So you want to make that. I know there are businesses who are more kingdom than churches. So we have to be very careful. This is not about just getting my own following. This is about aligning everyone to the king, because in his king, or we're just creating another community like anybody else, which I've just seen quite a bit of that.
This is why the kingdom is eternal. It's ever increasing. He will reign forever, and we're going to enjoy perfect community and perfect freedom under the king, and that's what everybody longs for.
That's the ultimate place of belonging, right? That's the ultimate place in which we can truly long for. People are longing for belonging, and they're really looking for the king. Yeah. So, anyway.
So, hey, if you're listening to this podcast, I want to invite you to come out Sunday. We got 3 amazing services, and we're not perfect people, but we are trying to follow Jesus. We're trying to love well, and we're trying to create amazing community where people, again, are known and belong and feel a part. So if that's you and you're looking for a great family, get off the internet, come experience some real people. But I'm glad you're on the internet now because you're watching this. But don't stay there. Come out to church and meet some real people and be a part of what God's doing. So thank you for watching. Until next week, share this with as many people as you can. It's the good news of Jesus Christ and his kingdom. It's where all the answers are found. All right, we love you all. Thanks for tuning in.